My name is Martin Klimke. I'm the head of the history program here at NYU Abu Dhabi, and it's my special pleasure today to welcome Dr. Frauke Heard-Bey for this luncheon event. Now, let me tell you a little bit about why you're here. You're here because we started doing this year research seminar in the history program. So research seminars to establish a culture of inviting local historians, historians from the UAE and the region, and connecting them to our work here at NYU Abu Dhabi, and bringing in affiliates from NYU New York to expose them to the kind of research that is happening here. And usually these research seminars are actually only for historians and are kind of closed events. So what happened was, when I sent out the program for our research seminar this year, we got so many requests from local historians, from the general public who heard about this, that we decided to turn this into a public event. And I'm very, very happy that we have so many people sitting here. I'm extremely happy to welcome a group from Albertine High School today who are with us, and I'm sure have a lot of questions for our guest speaker as well. I also would be remiss in standing here and not thanking the people who made this particular event possible, the people whom you see working diligently in the background, the people who have sponsored this event, Judy Miller from Arts and Humanities, Niels Lewis and Phil Kennedy from the Research Institute, and all the helping hands that have worked so tirelessly behind the scenes to make this event work for us. Now, if you've come to one of our history-related events, you have heard a lot about the history program of NYU Abu Dhabi. You've heard about our rather unorthodox approach to do global history based on an oceanic division of the world. We don't look at nation systems, we look at the world based on oceanic systems, the Mediterranean world, the Asia-Pacific world, the Indian Ocean world, and the Atlantic world. This is a very, let's just say, unorthodox way of looking at global history, but we believe it is one way to change the prism with which we view the past, and we'd like to invite you to do just that, not only tonight, but also for future events in our research seminar series and in the public lecture series that we're hosting together with the Research Institute called Globalizing Histories. Now let me introduce our speaker today. It was 1969 when a 20-year-old German historian and researcher stepped across the threshold of the formidable Qasr al-Hawzen to browse through a collection of books at a small office that became the National Center for Documentation and Research. Little did she know her decision would change her life forever. With these words, a recent feature in The National described our guest speaker today. It went on saying that, "I wanted to start researching and reading up on what was back then the Trucial States," recalled Frauke Heard-Bey. At the time, she had published a doctoral dissertation on the fate of Berlin during the political upheavals following the First World War. Now she lived with her British husband, David Heard, who's also with us today, a petroleum engineer in Abu Dhabi, after their marriage in 1967. "It was a completely new world to me, and I wanted to know more about it," she said. And so she took the first steps into understanding the Emirates by entering Qasr al-Hawzen. Now we're very, very happy and excited that she will share her experience of this new world with us today. She received her dissertation from the Free University in Berlin in 1967, and then, as I said, followed her husband to the UAE, to Abu Dhabi, where she has been living ever since. Her research into the social, economic, and constitutional history and the current developments of the countries of the Gulf resulted in numerous academic publications, among them From Trucial States to United Arab Emirates, published in Dubai in 2004, which you'll find outside in Arabic and in English, should you be so inclined to purchase this book. All in all, let me just say that I'm both pleased and honored to be able to welcome Dr. Heard-Bey as one of the leading scholars on the history of the UAE today. On a personal note, I was not only thrilled to find out recently that we share the same alma mater, which is the University of Heidelberg. I'm also very grateful to her for the fact that she has been a tremendous source of support and advice in reaching out to the local scholarly community here and creating events like these as part of our history program here at NYU Abu Dhabi. So in this spirit, I ask all of you to welcome Dr. Frauke Heard-Bey with a warm round of applause on why the UAE is a federation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin, for such very kind words. And I do just hope that I can, that this lecture can live up to it, to your expectation. Of course, this is now just what otherwise you are not doing, and that is, in fact, we now put a prism on one particular subject. Why is the UAE a federation? Well, what else could it be? It could be a centrally governed country, and indeed all the other members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, are not federations. In fact, you look around the Arab world and there isn't a federation that is functioning today. So indeed, the UAE is, from that point of view also, quite worth studying and investigating. What makes a federation? What is different compared to a centrally governed state? Well, certainly there is a hierarchy of authorities. If, for instance, you could imagine there's a hierarchy of the legal system, of the administrative system, and also a hierarchy and a competition for the resources, which in many places are, of course, collected by taxes. And then it's a question how much of the tax goes to the central super government, if you like, and how much is left or is given to the individual parts. And so there's always a competition, both between central and locally and local government, but also obviously between the various parts of the different governments. Now, where else do we find? I mean, there are many federations in the world. Also, it is a minority of states, but most prominently, obviously, the United States of America. Then we think of Germany as a federation, which has always been a federation except for the 12 years of the Nazi time. So there must be a good reason. And Nigeria is, and there are other federations. And if I say there must be a good reason, it is, in fact, why do countries then eventually end up being governed or running themselves as a federation and not in the way of a central government? That is obviously historical. The reason is and must be historical. But history develops always out of the place, the time and the place. So it develops out of the geography of a place, and it develops out of how this geography then plays out with a particular area. So I just summarize. You can see here what I would proceed to. I would first talk about the geography, the tribal structure. That's all what I consider important for this question of why the UAE is a federation. Then focus on the coasts, and anyway, I will go through these individual items. Here is one of my most important assistants for this talk, and that is a map which was made. It's the geology of the UAE, and it's part of an atlas done by the Environmental Agency of Environment of Abu Dhabi. Now, everything that is away from the coast is light-colored. It is desert, or when it's up there, it is the Hajar Mountains. And here are the mountains. They go here and through Oman. The communication with the UAE's closest neighbors, which would be Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, and all the other places, is almost impossible. Before you had aircraft, it was almost impossible. So an important aspect we have to think about is that the UAE's countryside has a very limited facilities for human habitation and for use, because much of it, most of it is desert or the mountains. That's just two pictures shot together, put together, just to show you what this desert actually means. It is now you see the traces of cars, you can go through it by car, but in the past it was really a formidable obstacle to communication over land. The only people who could overcome up to a point this problem were Bedouin, but even to go, for instance, from here on Hajj to Mecca was a very, very difficult undertaking. But these Bedouin with their camels, they knew how to. This is just to show you one settlement. Deliberately used not so pretty pictures, but the black and white pictures, just also to show how difficult, and this is somewhere near Ras Al Khaimah, a settlement. The picture was taken in the 50s, and it's a settlement with Arish houses, and of course you see the goats and so on. Having looked at the map and seen how very difficult it is communication with the rest of the world over land, what is one of the most important features of the UAE is, of course, that it has a coast. And not only one, it has two coasts. And unfortunately, we do not see, we do not see the other coast, which is, as you probably, I hope, all know, that the other coast, Fujairah, the east coast, is open to the Indian Ocean. And that immediately gives one the idea that that coast and everything of the UAE, or what it was before the Trucial States, are open to the outside world through the sea. The sea is the most important, and access to the sea is the most important point when it comes to rethinking about settlements and the accumulation of people. But wherever you have people living together, the one important thing, of course, is they do need water, even if they are happy with very little. But access to water is the essence of life. And again, in the UAE, there is very little chance of as we all know, there's very little rainfall. So the water is either runoff here from the mountains, all of it runoff from the mountains. Now, when you come to Abu Dhabi, it is already so far, and the mountains here are back here, so there is no more runoff. And the entire coast of Abu Dhabi, between Abu Dhabi and the western border, is then in fact an area, a coast that is no longer, it is not possible to have runoff water from the mountains. So one could imagine, or one you know, it is, that's a fact, that settlements would only be possible really in this area where the runoff and where there's water either by wells or by falash and so on, but it comes from the mountains. And as far as, just about as far as Dubai. And all of this coast here looks on the map just like a lovely coastal plain, and why not have lots of agriculture and lots of people living there? Well, not possible. So people were concentrated either living in the mountains, but where there were few springs, and then, and that is my other important point, that people concentrated on the coast. And even if there is less water than in the mountains, in the wadis, people concentrated living on the coast. And eventually used these, places where you can also park your ships and so on. So if we think about it now, all the 7 emirates do I need to enumerate them now? But Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah, Ajman, Al Quwain, Ras Al Khaimah, Fujairah. All of them are situated on the coast. And Fujairah is out of the picture, but it is on the coast, as you all know. And that has the geographical reason of having the runoff water, but being on the coast, having access to the sea. And since the 18th century, this access to the sea was even more vital and more important, because it was not only the trade and the carrying trade, because much of the trade, for instance, from Ras Al Khaimah was not necessarily bringing goods that were sold and eaten and so on in Ras Al Khaimah. It was the carrying trade, carrying other people's goods from one place to the other, which was since the 15th century, a very important maritime occupation and trade. So, but what came more important into the picture since about the second part of the 18th century was pearling, because pearls had always been found in the Gulf, and the pearl banks are, Anyway, the pearl banks are particularly off Abu Dhabi, but also between Abu Dhabi and Qatar, and that is where the pearls can be found, and it was an important industry which grew and grew from the 18th century onwards and employed ever more people, and therefore, of course, it was ever more important to have to have the settlements on the coast, and even people from the interior, from tribal interior, came to participate in the pearling industry. I'm not going to go into detail of how that worked, but it is important to remember that the pearling industry really concentrated the population of that whole area onto its coastal settlements where settling was possible because there was enough water. Now, having said that, there's also the question of, like for instance in Abu Dhabi, where there is not so much water, how do you get water? Well, you bring it. You can, for instance, this is here. This is someone who is actually bringing the water in his little box. When I talked about people from the interior also coming to the coast, that is a reference to the fact that, of course, there is some possibility of settlement also in the interior. For instance, this is the Al Ain Baremi Oasis, where there is again runoff from the mountains and the afflage, and it has been for millennia, I think for tens of thousands of years, people have settled in this area. Now, the other important oasis is a group of as many as 47 little villages, little settlements in the Liwa, which is an area where also fortuitously water can be found close to the surface, enough for people to drink, for animals to drink, and to raise date palms, but not more than that. There's no rainfall enough for field irrigation. Now, having seen the picture of where people settle, and how did this society then manage these very limited resources, what sort of society, what sort of people lived here? Well, we often hear about that it was a tribal structure, it still is a tribal structure. What does that mean? It means that the society was actually coordinated by people, elders, who would be responsible for coordinating things like allocating resources, like law. You need a legal system. You need people who who can judge when there is a problem between people. And of course you need security, and you need defense in war, and you need someone to coordinate this. And also a group of people vis-a-vis other people have they need their identity to be projected to the outside, and by what is called honor, and the Arabs certainly have very many words for this, and this projection, it is the sheikh's business to project the honor of the tribe to the outside. It is his business to be the judge. It is his business to lead the tribe or the tribal group or even a family in warfare or in just fighting to the outside. When I say the family, it's actually a tribal system, as you probably all know, is structured that you have a family and then a clan and then a tribal grouping and then often a tribal confederation on the very top. And the sheikh who is in charge of a tribal configuration can be very powerful. And that brings me to talk a little bit about a particular phenomenon I think one can see with regards to the tribal system of as it existed since the 18th century and before in this particular area. And that is that you could almost talk about two tribal empires. That is, you have the Qawasim, who were initially just a tribal family that became very wealthy and very important in this carrying trade at the head of the Gulf here, and on the other side even they had originally on the Iranian side also forts and worked this area, and then became the rulers of Ras Al Khaimah and of Sharjah, and sometimes in personal union all had sway over this entire area, really everything north of the Creek of Dubai. And the tribes and the smaller tribal rulers, had to they did pay allegiance to this big group of the Qawasim that's grew really in the 18th century and then played out a lot. I will come to that in the 19th century. Now, on the other hand, you had here, I've spoken about the Liwa. There is a group of the Bani Yas, which is the other big group of tribes, and that is a federation of tribes that is so close, as opposed to here they had to pay allegiance because they were pushed that way politically. Here, all the member sub-tribes of the Bani Yas voluntarily paid allegiance to the leading family of one of the Bani Yas, and that was the Abu Falah, which then later was called the Al Nahyan, but throughout until well into the 1950s, they were called the Abu Falah. But this group of tribes was originally lucky enough when they came from Central Arabia to find the well-watered dunes in the Liwa, occupy it and make it the center of their economic life. That means they had their date gardens, as I said, some 47 or so different villages were founded, and from here they occupied or they used this entire area of desert also for their grazing their camels. Very few goats, mostly camels, and then eventually, because the access was this whole area of desert abuts onto the sea. And so they then came to use the Gulf for fishing as well, and the islands offshore for fishing. And as I said earlier, since the late 18th century also importantly and increasingly for pearling. And that eventually drew many of the people who were, let's say, desert-bound to begin with, onto the coast. But as I said earlier, there was no water to be found easily, except runoff rainwater if you put a sail out and you let the water drop in and you collect it. But otherwise, very, very difficult to sustain big settlements on anywhere on this coast between really between Dubai and Qatar. But fortuitously, water was found on the island of Abu Dhabi. Not much, but enough to sustain a growing population. And once that growing population of people from the Liwa, from the Banias tribe, had settled there, then it was also possible. They had the boats and they engaged in pearling, and then also you can bring water from the islands, from Das, for instance. Das Island has natural water, and you can bring it from anywhere. And as this pearling industry grew and grew, in the 20th century, we know that beginning of the 20th century, there were many people, it was a big and booming industry, and many people living in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and water was brought by boat from Ras Al Khaimah, from Iran, from wherever. So if you have, like now, you desalinate, if you have enough money, shortage of water is no longer the constraint to your growing settlement. You can overcome that. Having talked about what a sheikh, what his function is in coordinating the life of the tribe, it is also often one then asks, well, what about if the community are not happy with their sheikh? And it is very important to bear in mind that in all these cases where you have the big sheikhs and then smaller sheikhs and so on, this privilege and also the obligation of looking after the tribe in the way I have explained is vested almost always in just one family. So as I mentioned already, the Banias, it was the Abu Falah, or now called the Al Nahyan, and since probably the 17th, 16th century, and the same in the north with the Qawasim, and all the other in between. It's always one family, but within that family, if a sheikh really disappointed, made a mess of it, was unfair, was not generous, because he would be the one who collects some taxes, for instance, the license to fish. Not everybody wanted to fish, but those who did, in some ways took from the natural resources that belong to everyone. So those who have a license to fish have to pay something, and this tax was collected by the ruler, but he wasn't meant to put it in his pocket. He did politics with it. He either had was very generous when people came to him. He would also sometimes pay off tribes would otherwise be very, very problematic. He would pay people who help in a skirmish or in a war, would have to pay them off. And he would have to give money to some poor people. He would have to give money to visitors, because vis-a-vis the visitors, the honor of the tribe is manifested, and so on. So if a sheikh really doesn't deliver on any of this, and is a bad judge, also makes very, very unpopular judgments, he may be replaced by his brother or his son or his uncle or someone who the community feels is a lot better, and that's the person they want. And that has happened in the past many times, but the point is, it is always someone from within that family. That is important. Another way of people who are not satisfied, not happy with really how the sheikh is sort of looking after the affairs of their community, is also that the community just demonstrates by foot, votes by foot. They just go and become and declare their allegiance to someone else. And also this has happened quite often, when they think he's either better or conditions are better. And for instance, that happened at some stage, no, not at some stage, precisely in 1833, when one group of the sub-tribes of the Banias decided to, they had an issue with the then ruler, and they decided to go and settle where there was already a small fishing community at the Creek of Dubai. And they were led by someone called Maktoum bin Buti in 1833, and they never returned. They stayed there, and that is the foundation of Dubai as we know it now. And as you well know, the ruling family of Dubai is the Al Maktoum, after this first Mr. Maktoum bin Buti, who got them to settle there. Why then? Why then do we actually end up with many, in fact at the moment, or recently already, with 7 emirates? It could be 9 or it could be 6. Part of the reason is that these here, people who were settled along the coast here, all had their own local ruler or tribal sheikh. And some of those, one can imagine, from time to time, wanted to be independent from the Al-Qawasim. And at other times, they found it easy, and then they also found it difficult. But one of the points, if I just go back for a moment to the first, I said focus on the coasts, yes, and fourth, through the relationship with the British. And we all know a little bit about the role that the British have played in the Gulf. But what was the impact, or what did the British in particular, or the British presence of the British in particular, why did this then end up that we have a federation in the UAE today? Now, for this, one has to maybe first go and engage a little bit with the history of the late 18th and early 19th century of this region. I have already talked about the carrying trade that the Qawasim were very good at, and they continued what was in the 15th century going on in Hormuz, and this kind of trade was all through the Indian Ocean, and those vessels that were involved in this would bring goods from one place to the other, and from there it would be picked up and brought onwards and either to the Far East or to Europe and so on. So it was not always a matter of that there should be many consumers at the end. For instance, in Ras Al Khaimah, there weren't, in Sharjah, there weren't many consumers, and yet the Qawasim were very big in this carrying trade. So were also the people in Muscat. And the Sultan from Muscat, from time to time, had big issue, and these ships then had a running war as well about who is carrying what and who is predominant in what part of the world. So the Qawasim certainly did have a huge issue with the people in Muscat, with the Omanis, all along the Omani coast. Now, it is also, we know that if the friend of your enemy is also your enemy, so it just worked out for different reasons that the East India Company, the English East India Company, which had been itself trying to trade into and through the Gulf and, of course, India, that's why it's called East India Company, needed the coast of Oman for its ships to replenish with water. They just needed, for what they wanted to do, a peaceful coast of Oman. And therefore, they placated whoever was the ruler on that coast, the Sultan. And if the Sultan had a war going, it was quite likely that ships from the East India Company were helping him. So, with this problem between the Qawasim and the people in Muscat, the Sultan, it was obvious to see that the East India Company's ships also became the foes of particularly the ships of the Qawasim. Anyway, they were running battles back and forth the end of the 18th century, and then from the East India Company they decided in 1818, 1819 in the winter to mount a decisive attack on the Qawasim. In that case, the Qawasim, as they had all their trading vessels and also war fleets and so on, assembled in Ras Al Khaimah. And so the East India Company descended on that region and just had an attack, and they burned all the ships, all the seagoing vessels they could find, and then proceeded also along the coast. And because one didn't quite know who was then in league with the Qawasim and who was, along this coast here more independent or a foe of the Qawasim, it didn't matter. All along the coast, really, the seagoing vessels one could find, they were disabled or burnt or, And that was, of course, a big calamity. And once there was, the victory of the East India Company ships and their commander was then instructed to make a peace so that there was no longer a reason to come again. And because the Qawasim were no longer in a position really to argue very much, they did, as one does, enter into a peace negotiations and a peace treaty. And the East India Company commander also then managed to get all the sheikhs who sort of lived along and who were known to them in all these places, all the way down to Abu Dhabi. They invited them to join in a treaty in 1820. And this was, of course, not all done on one day. They sort of came and visited here, did a treaty with Ras Al Khaimah and with Rams and so on, and then treaty here and treaty there, and even with the Sheikh of Bahrain, because a lot of booty was actually sold in Bahrain. So all together, and there was already even so, there were 11 sheikhs who signed this treaty of 1820. It was, in the British parlance, in the English parlance of the time, it was called a truce. And this is quite a sort of now a word that's not used very often. But this is how it came about that these states now became the trucial states. Or to begin with, it was the trucial sheikhs, the trucial rulers. And this word then became the official name of all the states that had entered into this treaty. And this treaty of 1820 was then followed throughout the 19th century by treaties that reinforced this peace. Now, in the beginning, one could say the peace of 1820 was a diktat. But it also really, in the end, worked out extremely well for all the people who lived along the coast and all the people who were engaged in the pearling, because any rivalry, any problem between any of those coastal settlements, absconding debtors and boats being pushed and all sorts of problems, usually were fought out on the sea, and in particular during the pearling season, which was at the height of summer, which was very, very disruptive for those people who were engaged in this industry. And year after year after year, you have no security on the high seas, and the pearling is disrupted and so on, and people also raid each other coming with ships and burn the barastis, and so on. This was very unsettling. So it turned out to be not unwelcome to have an outside power, which was something like a policeman, to keep the peace in the Gulf. And eventually these treaties then actually turned out to become the perpetual treaty of peace, which meant that these sheikhs of all these settlements, they committed not to engage into any military act, any aggressive act conveyed by sea. So they could no longer either attack each other during the pearling season or attack each other even by going by vessel from one place to the other. And as we know, as we have seen, communication along the hinterland and the mainland was always much more difficult. So one communicated with each other by sea. So if that is curtailed, that military action is no longer possible, that eventually worked out extremely positively, and certainly helped for all these communities to become very much more wealthy, because the pearling industry could flourish. People who have a lot of money to dispose buy a lot of things, so there were goods imported mostly from India. Indian traders then settled everywhere, in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, everywhere, and trade was flourishing. And it also meant that more and more people came from the interior, and either just for the summer or altogether lived on the coast and participated in this booming economy. But in some ways, who benefited most of all from this booming economy was the tribal sheikhs. Because by then, you could see, it was 11 sheikhs who signed in 1820, and then some fell by the wayside, and some got two settlements, became under one ruler, and so on. Anyway, it eventually worked out when these further treaties were negotiated and signed. Who signed? It was not your normal pearl diver. It was not even your normal captain or the people who owned and financed the pearling dhows. It was Sheikh so-and-so and Sheikh so-and-so. Sheikh so-and-so from Ras Al Khaimah, Sheikh so-and-so of Ajman, Sheikh so-and-so. And they were the counterparts in political, in the political work, but also in much political hanky-panky. And it eventually, at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, it worked out that every sheikh who had a treaty relationship with the British, who was then in India, who then, after 1854, I think, was then the government of India. Everyone who had a treaty relationship was honored with the visit of a British political person, and so on, of course, had a much higher standing than any sheikh who just lived in the interior. So by time and through generations, those sheikhs that were signatories were very, very much more important than any other sheikh. And by the 20th century, it worked out that indeed, when inside the family, as I explained earlier, there was a change, there was even some, the sheikh died and the son took over, but the sheikh died and maybe his brother took over and so on. Whoever then became the successor actually had to, he was asked by the British authorities, who had, maybe I forgot to say so, there was inside the Gulf a sort of supervisory group of political people sitting in Bushehr, and they had ships, and they came to visit from time to time and find out what was happening. And they also had a representative later in Sharjah who wrote letters and said, this is happening, that is happening, and this sheikh is not happy, and those people are not happy with their sheikh, and so on. So when there was a change of rulership, the ruler, actually the successor, had to formally sign that he subscribed to all the treaties that his predecessor had subscribed to. And this was then in a special dossier. They were all accumulated and they were all signed. So only the sheikh who had formally received this dossier and signed it and so on, he was a trucial sheikh. Everybody else was an also run. But things change and economic situations change and so on. So in fact, throughout the early 19th century, we have many cases where suddenly these sort of British political people realized, well, the Sheikh of Khan, actually, which is next door to Sharjah, is actually, he's very, very important, and he gets huge amounts of support from tribes from the interior. He is really very, very important. And next time, the big British political resident comes from Bushehr, he is also attending the big political, and it sort of works out, well, that in the correspondence they then say, well, maybe the ruler of Khan, actually, maybe he should become a trucial ruler. But then he got murdered by someone, and so the whole thing blew over. But I just wanted to demonstrate that this was not hard and fast, that the trucial rulers were once a particular sheikhdom was a trucial sheikhdom and stayed there forever. No. Another example is very much later, in the 1930s. Sadly, this is not on this map, but the east coast of the UAE, Sharjah, Fujairah, Kalba, Khorfakan, was really quite far from the Qasimi rulers who were placed in Sharjah and Ras Al Khaimah. So the east coast was nominally under the suzerainty of the ruler of Sharjah, but became ever more loose, and the tribes of the east coast eventually tried and under one particular tribal leader tried to shake the system and become, and so eventually Kalba was recognized as a trucial state in 1937 for other reasons that I will come to. So 1937, Kalba is a trucial state, but then the ruling family dies out, and so Khalas, Kalba is no longer. In 1951, Kalba is no longer a trucial state, but it just so happens that Fujairah is also the ruler of Fujairah, the ruler of the Sharqiyin, which was after the Baniyas, is the biggest single homogeneous tribe of the UAE, and the ruler of the tribal sheikh, the big sheikh of the Sharqiyin, had always been trying to become a trucial ruler, and in 1952 he succeeded. Kalba was finished, Fujairah became a trucial state, and again for different reasons, and so in fact, in 1952, then we end up with 7 trucial states. And why? Well, 7 trucial states. I do have to come now to the one point that everybody knows about the UAE, and therefore we come to oil. Because I talked a lot about the pearling industry, which was a boom in beginning of the 19th century, and everybody was also thinking that every year was better. There was the statistics show that more pearls were found, more pearls were sold to India for a higher price and so on. So there seemed to be no end to this fantastic boom. Alhamdulillah, it's just going on. And then suddenly it was killed very dramatically by the world depression, the 30s, and the invention of cultured pearls in Japan. And the jewelers of New York and Paris didn't, when they got cheaper and just as perfect pearls from Japan, well, why bother to send their people to Bahrain and to Bombay and so on? So very, very suddenly this boom, really the bottom broke out of it. And people who worked in it had also abandoned their other income and in inland and so on. So that was a very, very dramatic reduction of the economy. And then the Second World War happened, and even worse, it was so disastrous that even in the 50s, some people emigrated from the UAE to Qatar, where already oil had been found, and other places, Kuwait and so on, to work in the oil industry there, because really the trucial states were economically incredibly depressed. Now, why didn't one have the oil earlier, and why, we all know that there's lots of oil? Well, it has to be found first. And first of all, one actually has to sort of have the license to look for it. And again, it reinforces this idea that there are these different sheikhs, and they have, by the middle of the 20th century, become very individually important politically to the outside world. And therefore, you couldn't have a company, an oil company, just saying, well, let's look for this, let's look for oil in all these places and maybe we find some. No. The oil company had to knock at every fort door and laboriously negotiate agreements with the Sheikh of Dubai and the Sheikh of Ras Al Khaimah and the Sheikh of so and so and so and so. And people came from London and from Bahrain and so on. And my husband has written a book about these early negotiations in the 30s and early 40s, which also shed a light on how this individualism of the individual rulers was important, it was honored, and it was economically and politically now a force to reckon with. Now, eventually, by the end of the 30s, all these trucial states, the whole trucial coast, so to speak, was covered with concessions for one oil company, and with the exception of, as I said, Fujairah of the east coast. But then the Second World War happened, and no follow-up, because in the war there was neither people nor steel nor money to now look for oil, and therefore it was in abeyance until in 1949 the first effort was made to actually make these concessions now look for oil. And yet it was by no means certain that there would be oil here. It was in Bahrain and Kuwait and so on, Eastern Saudi Arabia, but whether something would be found here or not. But anyway, they looked, and the first oil well was in Abu Dhabi territory in Ras Sada, and it was dry. It swallowed up 1 million British pounds, which is a lot in 1949-50. Anyway, one important point with this now search for oil was actually that this, the individuality of the individual of these trucial states also played out in the fact that when the oil company, which had concessions for the whole area, moved their rig to somewhere else, that is to Dubai territory, they were obliged to engage a whole set of new local people to help, because it was a different emirate and it was a different ruler and it was different agreements and so on. So that's just to demonstrate that by the 1950s, this individualism of the various trucial states was totally ingrained. It was political and it was economically entirely ingrained. Now, quickly to go through the oil, it was oil was eventually found in commercial quantities offshore in Abu Dhabi and then onshore in Abu Dhabi. It was first exported in 1960 from offshore, and in 1962 from offshore, and in 1964 from Jebel Dana onshore, which is way over in the west of Abu Dhabi, somewhere over, anyway, in the west, near Sarbanias. And so from then on, 1964, so from then on, Abu Dhabi could look forward to an income from oil, and it was soon seen that this is actually very prolific, and now everybody was suddenly engaged with the buzzword development. First of all, in Abu Dhabi, the ruler, then Sheikh Shahbood, started quite a few projects, which then, from 1966, when his brother Sheikh Zayed took over, then really got these and all the other projects going, and development was the buzzword. But what about the other emirates? Well, Dubai also, oil was found in commercial quantities in 1967, so that was quite a lot later. But the British authorities also, after the Second World War and after the United Nations were making a lot of song and dance about, you know, what do you actually do, you the British and you the French and you the Americans as well. What do you do with territories which are still partly dependent on you, and how, you know, why are they still backwards and why this and that and why the other? And therefore, an effort was made to now address the social situation of the trucial states. And this effort panned out in that first of all, with British help, the Trucial States Development Council, the Trucial States Council was founded, and that was the idea of getting the 7 rulers to sit together from time to time and think about and discuss how the limited aid money that came from London could be distributed and used fairly between all of them for limited development. And that was in the 1950s. Now, when oil was found in Abu Dhabi and one looked forward to a lot more money and so on, immediately Sheikh Shahbood volunteered to participate, to put more money into this fund, the Trucial States Development Fund. Also, money came from Qatar and Kuwait, and some of the efforts were also, they sent teachers, because some training colleges were developed and agricultural development stations were built and so on, and some soil analysis and all this sort of thing one does when one it tries to develop a country that really does need help. And so this Trucial States Development Council was a venue where the rulers got together from time to time. In fact, mostly they met in Dubai, where there was by then the British political agency, something like an embassy, but a mini embassy. And in that place, they got together and they discussed together matters to do with all their states together. And that can be seen as a forerunner, really, of the federation that came later. At least they all sort of visually saw each other more often, because otherwise it was quite often only the neighboring rulers who actually visited each other for a wedding or maybe condolences and so on. But this brought the rulers together, and they could get a feel also of what was needed where and what everybody wanted. And that was in the 1950s and 60s. And I think by that time everybody was quite happy. There was again more prosperity. One could look forward to more prosperity all round. Development was somehow modestly, but was in hand. One did not need to worry about aggression from outside, from any foe outside. Even Abu Dhabi did not need to worry anymore about Saudi Arabia eating up most of its territory, because that was in the process for a long time, and then was finally put to rest by the British actually throwing out a Saudi contingent from Buremi. So that was in 1955, so that one could have the confidence now that aggression from abroad, from outside, was taken care of by the British, because that was their contractual business to do. Similarly, their contractual business was to defend or to represent the Trucial States diplomatically on the world stage, United Nations and elsewhere. So, in fact, the Trucial rulers were quite happy that their situation was looking up, and yet they didn't have to worry about security and outside thing. But all of this was suddenly, all of this security, this comfort that now, oil is coming, money is coming, development is coming, and now suddenly all of this was put into jeopardy at a time also when, I should mention that, when the rest of the Arab world was in huge turmoil in the late 60s, and the Middle East problem, and there was communism was looming, and what does one do vis-a-vis communism and socialism and Baathism and all the isms and the problems from Iraq and the problems from southern Yemen, where there was an active people actively engaged in undermining the security of the Gulf countries. They had forged a grouping, and so on. So, in view of all these dangers from outside, it was very comfortable to be under the British umbrella. Now, suddenly in London, the government under the Labour leader Wilson decided to withdraw all British commitments to east of Suez. And this was a long discussion, and it was decided also in light of what happened in Aden that this was all going to be withdrawn, all the troops and all the representation east of Aden, east of Suez. But for a time they said, not the Gulf. The Gulf, we still stay, don't worry, we are still here, we are your friends, we support you, and so on. And that was the message that somebody had to bring to the Trucial Sheikhs in December 1968. 67. He was sent, the same man was sent to bring a different message in January 1968 to say, no, the Gulf also, Britain is going to withdraw from the Gulf. And that was a big shock at that time. It was not, hooray, freedom and all of that. It was a big shock, because what do we do now? And in that situation, it was, and they were all 7 trucial states were in the situation, but also because it's the whole Gulf, it also pertained to Qatar and Bahrain, which had very similar agreements and arrangements with Britain. And to an extent also, of course, Oman and Kuwait, which already was independent since 61, and Oman, which was still under the old Sultan, and also Iran. I mean, everybody was suddenly saying and scurrying for cover. What are we going to do now? And particularly within these trucial states, the trucial rulers were very much in one and the same boat. So it took little persuasion from any side to say, let's create a federation. And the idea that was that had already been mooted by the ruler of Bahrain and I think the foreign minister of Kuwait, then took traction, but before they could even, these two people could really get it on paper and get people to meet, Sheikh Zayed and the ruler of Dubai, Sheikh Rashid bin Saeed, got together in February. The decision was in January. In February 68, they got together on the frontier between the two emirates, sorted out their border problems, signed and so on, and then said, we make a federation, we make a union, and in this union we do foreign affairs and this and that and the other. And immigration, we make concerted effort. But immediately they said, this union is, we have decided upon Abu Dhabi, Dubai, but it is open to others to join. And they sent invitations to all the other trucial rulers and to Qatar and Bahrain. Now that was also already in the eyes of the British politicals that this could be a good idea to have the 7 trucial states in Bahrain and Qatar together in one union. And indeed, they all said, yes, we come. So in March, I think, the first meeting of these 9 rulers was taking place in Dubai. And one could imagine that it was, rulers getting together. This is very much protocol and friendliness and chit-chat and sitting in majlis and so on. Nothing of it, because there were some people who already wanted to make nails with heads, and particularly from Qatar. The ruler of Qatar was helped or guided along by an Egyptian who was very keen on constitutional matters and so on. Anyway, Qatar put together an agenda with many, many different points. And we have to discuss this and this and this and this and this. And suddenly, these 9 rulers some of them really did not know what was, why this was so formal and so on. But nevertheless, one worked through this. There was then a protocol, and it all developed in a very much more professional manner than maybe was expected to begin with. And one worked on a constitution, so that all these 9 emirates would agree on a compromise on a constitution. Now, there was a spanner was thrown in the works, and that was when in Britain there was an election, and the Conservatives, I told you that the decision in 67, 68 was the Labour Party. Now the Conservatives were dead against this decision, and they had also sent people around the Gulf and so on and said, trust us, if we come to form the next government, we will reverse the decision. So relax. And so eventually in June of 1970, the Conservatives came to government in London and didn't immediately say, yes, we reverse everything and, you know, the British umbrella over the Gulf is staying and so on. No, they hummed and hawed and think and so on, and did not, which was totally unhelpful for those people who for 3 years, for years already had been discussing the federation of the Nine. And now they didn't know, was it necessary, was it not necessary? And only in March of 1971, the British government said, well, it looks as though it really does make more sense because time has marched on and things have developed and Britain is withdrawing and go ahead with, you know, forging your union, the Union of the Nine. The other problem for the Union of the Nine was indeed, there were many problems. One of them, for instance, that Bahrain, which was very active, but Bahrain was so much more developed. And indeed, you wouldn't believe this now, but Bahrain had the biggest population of all of them, 200,000, whereas at the time of federating, the UAE had 180,000 people living here. So Bahrain was stronger. It had, it was already advanced in also constitutional matters. They wanted a very fancy constitution, very modern, and so on. So there were conditions which were almost impossible to overcome. But the added problem with Bahrain was that it was immediately in '68, Iran suddenly piped up and said, well, if you British disappear, we are going to, first of all, be a third power. Sort of, there was a superpowers and so on, and then there were some small third powers like Turkey and Iran fancied themselves. And so certainly we have the clout and we now take back Bahrain, which has always been a jewel in the crown and all of that. And the Majlis in Tehran actually decided that they would then, Bahrain was going to be a province of Iran. But the Iranians didn't want this at all. And anyway, to cut a long story short, the UN sent someone to ascertain, not in a formal, you know, every person giving a vote, but they ascertained what the Bahrainis wanted to do by asking almost everybody, every group of inhabitants. And it came out that the Bahrainis wanted to be independent. And so this was proclaimed. The UN conveyed this to Tehran. And surprisingly, the Shah decided, okay, let the Bahrainis have Bahrain. We climb down and don't insist on this jewel in the crown, which he could do, and the Majlis had to, you know, his parliament had to be content with this. So after this decision was made public, Bahrain was free to actually say, whoopee, now we also don't go with this Union of the Nine. We go our way alone, and declared in July of '71 that Bahrain would be an independent, separate state, the Emirate of Bahrain. And immediately after that, Qatar said, well, in that case, we go it alone as well. So these 7 trucial states were left behind. Not unhappy, I think, about the developments. And already these early developments was early summer '71. In July of 1971, the 7 trucial states got together in Dubai and discussed once again how to agree on a constitution, agreed on a provisional constitution, signed it on, I think, the 28th of July, with the exception of Ras Al Khaimah, the ruler of Ras Al Khaimah, Sheikh Zakar, disagreed and had the issue of the islands, of course, and so he voted out of it, but and only joined in early '73 in February or whatever. But anyway, the trucial states were then really free to negotiate amongst each other. Negotiation, as I said, went quite quickly because they more or less just used the blueprint that had already been worked over by all the nine, the Union of the Nine, and what was left they just changed a little bit and so on. Anyway, it was to be, in any case, just a provisional constitution, and it was written in that it would be a provisional constitution for 5 years, and then there should be a revision. So that was the summer of 1971. Simultaneously, already, Abu Dhabi also had decided to have a cabinet, a proper Abu Dhabi cabinet with ministers and so on. And that was actually before July, because they didn't know what was going to happen, and one wanted to be ready for the deadline of December '71 to have an Abu Dhabi government in place. That was then abolished again in 1973, because once the federation was declared and the final signing of authorities and so on, for instance, over the military, the trucial state scouts, and certain jurisdiction and so on, was all signed off on the 2nd of December by the British representative at the time, Sir Geoffrey Arthur. After that, the UAE was created, standing on its own, having to fend for itself. And the political side was now agreed and sorted out, but the practical sides, of course, it was all almost at zero. Infrastructure, there were no roads between, even the road between Abu Dhabi and Dubai was a dirt track of many wide, many tracks next to each other. There was no road communication with the East Coast. There was still, it was easiest to go from Dubai to Fujairah by boat and round the Musandam. And so everything was being built. And ministries, you had to, find the ministers and find the ministers who work for the ministers and so on. Anyway, it was all in the building. But what made it so positive and so eventually also so successful was that there was money. And that's something that really does help in every such situation. And Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Zayed, and the people around him, they were wholeheartedly committed to committing Abu Dhabi money for the federal effort. And so in the first years, actually, of the federation, the budget, the federal budget, was every year was way over. Money was dedicated to the federal budget, and it could not be used up because there wasn't the facility to actually use it up. There wasn't enough cement and enough infrastructure and so on. So every year, the budget was actually, there was money left over. What a marvelous situation, but it sort of was for quite a few years. It was like that. And that just to reinforce the picture of that, the Abu Dhabi, which was also is by the way, is the biggest in area of all the 7 trucial states. In fact, it has 87% of the land mass of the United Arab Emirates. So Abu Dhabi acted big, and it continues to act big in that we all know that the federal effort really comes out of the Abu Dhabi pocket. And that is one of the important glues to this federation. That, but another question nevertheless is, why are people, why did it really become why did the federation work out like that? And I think there are many reasons. As I earlier said, it is the geography, it is the fact that these individual rulers then became sort of emerged as had such a stature that also politically you couldn't neglect them anymore. You couldn't suddenly say we make politics without these rulers. Impossible. But the other factor was that there was money to glue it all together and to make it happen. And that, of course, meant that the population was ever more beholden to what the federation could do for them. Initially, people whose crucial state was sort of developing slowly, in Dubai, for instance, or in Sharjah, they always expected the development and the progress and so on to be initiated and to come via and through their ruler and the ruling family. But now there was this other track. If it's the federation that builds us the roads. It's the federation that actually, the Ministry of Education builds schools in Fujairah and houses in Ras Al Khaimah and so on. So there was this double hope that, inshallah, our sheikh will listen to what we want and do this and that for us. And on the other hand, from the federation, things are getting better and better. And this double track actually was often difficult for the political situation to remain stable, because the individual rulers and ruling families did not want to suddenly become irrelevant. And it would not have been possible in this society to consign the other ruling families to irrelevance. So Sheikh Zayed and the people around him also realized that these rulers and their ruling houses and so on also have to be maintained. They have to have enough money or enough means to continue to project their standing, and so, in fact, often I think, we don't know, one doesn't know the details, but money was actually transferred to Sheikh so-and-so and Sheikh so-and-so. But also, Sheikh so-and-so would come to Abu Dhabi and say, we need a new power station, and please make sure. And so it was sometimes not paid for by the federal, but directly from Abu Dhabi, directly. Houses built in Fujairah and so on. So this double track of just pushing development and satisfying, first of all, the expectation of the local population. Now, even at the time of federation, the local population was already almost in a minority. And at the 25th anniversary of the UAE, it certainly was, one doesn't know, there were no statistics on that score, but between 17 and 15% local population, even then, and now we can see that maybe local population is even less, but nevertheless, they are the people who count, and they are the people for whom we all do something in this country. And but what I think is very important is to see also that the federation then also worked for the local people in a way it projected to the foreign, to the outside world, to the foreign, within the Arab world to begin with. There was a very dedicated and decided policy to almost, one could say, to butter up, but certainly to be engaged with the Arab neighbors and the Arab world, which was in such turmoil, and with the Palestinian problem and so on. So in fact, particularly Abu Dhabi embraced the Palestinian problem in every way, financially, psychologically, through the media and so on, which again also, obviously that wasn't intended, but it did endear this federation. Then it was always done in the name of the federation, not in the name of Abu Dhabi. It was all foreign aid and all projection was in the name of the federation. And so it endeared this federation to the Arab world and eventually, as we all know, to the rest of the world. And certainly seen from the outside, the United Arab Emirates is now a solid country, and its citizens also, they may, inside the country, they may say, I'm from Ras Al Khaimah and I'm from the so-and-so tribe, and we live in Al Ain and so on. But outside, they are United Arab Emirates, and there's no question about it. And they're in fact quite upset if people say, what, we only know Dubai. Well, we are from the United Arab Emirates. And that is the success, I think, of the federation, which I think it has come a long way, and I will stop here. This was what we have been talking about, the desert. This is the only way to cross the desert. And that was transport, local transport, and that was tending the dead gardens again. You need some help to transport things. This was taken from a publication, the first issue of Gulf Times, published in August of 1968. And we just grabbed this from, I think it's a very telling thing, no more water problems in Abu Dhabi. Selling fish, of course, that's one down. Another picture, this is an early, again, 68 is a girls' school. It also demonstrates who was wearing what at that time, 1968. This is the first hotel, a beach hotel in Abu Dhabi. That is the meetings of the sheikhs. This is the 9 sheikhs all sitting together at the head of the table, Sheikh Zayed and all of them around in discussions, and that's another aspect of Sheikh Zayed and the rule of Bahrain. Now, that's the final picture of signing on the 2nd of December, signing at the bottom end here is Jeffrey Arthur, and that is signing the United Arab Emirates into existence. Khalas.